Sound check, 1, 2, 3. Sound check, sound check. Okay, so it is 12 o'clock, so we will call this meeting to order. Everyone ready? Okay, we are live. A reminder that all electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. Please note that quorum is present today. Our first order of business is the appointment of chair and vice chair. So may I please have a nomination of the position of chair for the Hamilton Municipal Heritage Subcommittee for the term. I see Karen. Do you have a nomination?
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to nominate Alyssa to carry on her role of chair.
Are there any other nominations before we second this? Seeing none, do we have a seconder? I see Graham. Alyssa, before we vote, do you accept the nomination?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Okay, are there any opposed? Seeing none, that motion carries. So just bear with us as we hand over your chair's procedures. It's a tricky.
Well, thank you very much for that nomination and for the vote. I do appreciate it. We now move on to our appointment of the vice chair for 2023 to 2026. So may I please have nominations for the position of vice chair of the Hamilton Municipal Heritage Committee for this term?
I see Lynn.
I'd like to nominate Graham Carroll as vice chair. Okay. Is there a seconder for the nomination?
And I see Karen as a seconder.
And are there any further nominations for the position of vice chair of the Hamilton Municipal Heritage Committee? So there being no further nominations, may I please have a motion to appoint Graham as our vice chair of the Hamilton Municipal Heritage Committee? Okay, and the motion is moved and seconded, and the committee. Congratulations, Graham. So before we get started, I want to welcome the new committee for this term, welcome new members and members from the past. And as we go through, we will start with our roll call. If I can just get everyone to acknowledge their presence. We have Councillor Kretsch.
I'm here.
Karen Burke.
Present.
Graham Carroll.
Present.
Lynn Ludstead.
Present.
Andy McLaren.
Present.
Andrew Douglas.
Here.
And we have Stefan Spolnick.
Present.
Madam Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Chair, there are changes to the agenda. There was the addition of the staff presentations, item 8.1 through 8.3. And there was also an added consent item, the under delegated approval, heritage permit application, item J, heritage permit application HP 2023-052, the installation of municipal heritage plaque at 289 Dundas Street East.
Thank you. May I have a motion to approve the agenda as amended?
I see Graham. And I see Andrew.
And is there anyone opposed? Seeing none, that item is carried. We move on to our declarations of interests. Are there any declarations of interest that need to be declared today? Seeing none, we'll move on to our approval of the meeting minutes from our previous meeting. We have our meeting notes from October 20th, 2023. May I have a motion to approve the minutes as presented?
I see Karen. I see Lynn.
Is there any discussion on those meeting minutes? If not, we will vote. Is there anyone opposed? Seeing none, that item is carried. Under our communication items, may I have a mover and a seconder to put the communication items on the floor? Item 5.1 to 5.7.
I see Graham and I see Andy.
Okay. Are there any questions in regards to these items from the committee? Graham?
Yeah, I'm just curious, is the province expecting us as citizens to make comments on that one section and send it back in?
Alyssa?
Through the chair, so Alyssa Golden, Cultural Heritage Program Lead. So the two correspondences that are on the agenda today on behalf of Infrastructure Ontario relate to the two courthouse properties. So that's item 5.4 and 5.5. So the firm that's working with the province on this consultation would like Heritage Committee's feedback on these surveys. Recognizing that we haven't yet established any working groups, staff had suggested that we first put these two surveys on the agenda for you folks to be able to see the content of the feedback that they're looking to get from you. And then you'll see actually later on the agenda, there's also a delegation request. So they will be attending the next meeting in December to actually get formal feedback from you folks. So we wanted to make sure that you could see the survey questions, sort of absorb them, reflect on them, and then we'll be looking to actually get formal feedback at the next meeting. And sorry, thank you. And in addition to feedback from this committee, staff has also provided feedback on these surveys directly to the consultants, so that's already been submitted.
Thank you for that. Is there any other questions in regards to those items? If not, we will vote on receiving the communication items. As we move to vote, is there anyone opposed to receiving? Seeing none, then those items are carried. Under our delegation request, as Alyssa just mentioned, may I have a mover and a seconder to put the delegation request on the floor? Our delegation request is 6.1 is Kayla Jonas Galvin, who's the Archaeological Research Associates Limited, and Miranda Brunton from Infrastructure Ontario, respecting cultural heritage evaluation for Johnson Pinka Courthouse and the SCJ Family Courthouse for our future meeting.
I see Graham and I see Karen.
Okay. And is there any questions from the committee in regards to that delegation request? If not, we'll vote. Is there anyone opposed? Seeing none, that item is carried. Under our staff presentations, we now have 8.1 is an introduction to the Cultural Heritage Planning, Hamilton Municipal Heritage Committee member orientation. So we have Alyssa Golden, Program Lead from the Heritage and Urban Design, is here to give a presentation.
Thank you, Chair. So again, Alyssa Golden, Cultural Heritage Program Lead. Recognizing that we are starting the new term of this committee, we thought it'd be a good idea to go through a bit of an introduction. We do have a number of returning members. We also do have some other members who have also been cross-appointed to permit review and may have seen a little bit of overlap in terms of this introduction. So I'll try to be brief and happy to answer any questions afterwards and go into any more detail that folks might want to ask about. As soon as my screen advances. There we go. So just in terms of the scope of the presentation today, talk about the role of this committee, give a bit of an introduction to heritage planning in Ontario, understanding the different heritage statuses that we deal with, a little bit on heritage permits, a discussion around proactive heritage inventory work that we do here at the city, and then a brief introduction to some of the financial incentives that we offer for designated heritage properties. So this Hamilton Municipal Heritage Committee is established under the Ontario Heritage Act. It follows the term of council. Currently, it is this new committee was formed with 6 citizen-appointed members and 1 councillor member. As you've been advised, it does meet monthly, and we are meeting under a hybrid format, so we do have some members here virtually today. We do circulate the agenda a week before the meeting. Often there can be quite a bit of content, so just try to check as soon as possible if you can, especially if there's some pretty dense reports that we might be looking for feedback on. The chair does run the meeting and is assisted by our legislative coordinator, hearing clerks. And these meetings, as we're advised at the start, are public. They're also live streamed and recorded and archived on our city website and YouTube page. And as they are public meetings, there is also an opportunity for folks to delegate and speak at these meetings. And I'll just touch on a bit of the mandate and the role of this Heritage Committee. So it is an advisory body. It is not an approval body. It advises both staff and council on matters under the Ontario Heritage Act. This primarily relates to the designation of property, the review of heritage permit applications, and other general heritage conservation measures under the Act, both parts 4 and 5 of the Act dealing with individual properties and heritage conservation districts. This committee also assists in the preparation, evaluation, and maintenance of our list of properties of interest, as well as areas worthy of conservation or cultural heritage landscapes, as well as other matters related to the conservation of those properties that we've identified as being of interest. It also advises on and assists with programs to increase public awareness and knowledge of heritage conservation issues. There's also generally a annual report that this committee provides, although in the past few years, staff has assisted with the preparation of sort of a summary of the proceedings and efforts of the committee over the years. So that will be coming to the next meeting. I'll note this now, and we'll circle back around to this a little bit later, but where possible, we also look for members to assist and sit on one of the various working groups or subcommittees, and potentially participate in other external groups or other stakeholder committees within the areas of interest or areas of the community that they might be representing. And then probably the big one also for this committee is participation and running the annual Hamilton Municipal Heritage Committee Recognition Awards as well. In terms of the structure, again, this is an advisory committee. Ultimately, Hamilton City Council is the decision body in terms of recommendations to designate properties or new heritage districts. And this committee reports up to the main City Council through Planning Committee. And you'll also see here in terms of some of the other reporting structure, the working groups I mentioned that report up through to this committee, as well as the Heritage Permit Review Subcommittee, which is another citizen-appointed, council-appointed subcommittee of citizen members. We also have in the past had another advisory committee specific just to the Cross Melville Heritage District to relate to heritage permits within that district, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in a second. In terms of our staff reporting structure, so our Cultural Heritage Planning team is located within the Planning and Economic Development Department, which is generally run by Jason Thorne, our General Manager. However, we do have a bit of a shift currently in terms of acting roles. Under that is the Planning Division Director and Chief Planner, who is typically Steve Robichaud, but with us today we have Shannon Mackay, who's the Acting Chief Planner and Director of Planning. And then moving down from that, we have our Heritage and Urban Design section, our Director Ken Coit, with me to my left here, and the Manager of Heritage and Urban Design, Jana Kelman, is also at the end of the row here, waving. And then in terms of our more immediate cultural heritage planning team, so as I mentioned, I'm the program lead. We do have 3 permanent cultural heritage planning positions filled by Emily Bent, who's currently on vacation. We have Meg Oldfield, who's second from the left down the row. And we currently have a vacancy that we're in the process of filling, a temporary role while one of our members is on leave. And then we also have some supporting positions. We have 2 temporary cultural heritage planning technician roles. One of them is currently filled by Scott Dickinson, who's just in the middle of us here on the left and will be presenting to you later today. And we also have a vacancy that's come up. Meg recently was successful in filling the permanent cultural heritage planning role. She was in one of these tech roles previously, so we're currently in the role of, in the process of filling that. And then we also have a wonderful heritage student that assists us with all of our work behind the scenes, Kaylee McPherson currently, and we'll have a new student in the new year. And I'll just briefly touch on some of our subcommittees and working groups for your information. So as I mentioned, Permit Review Subcommittee. This subcommittee, again, not an approval body, an advisory body, but assists in advising staff, this committee, and council on matters related to heritage permit applications under the Heritage Act. And I will note that we typically require members to be cross-appointed from this committee to that subcommittee, but we did actually have 3 members appointed to both as a part of the selection process, so we don't necessarily need to cross-appoint any additional members from this committee to that subcommittee this term. And I'll just thank Karen, who accepted and was appointed as chair of this subcommittee. Thank you. And as I mentioned, there's the Cross Melville HCD Advisory Committee. Unfortunately, we did not receive sufficient interest to fill this advisory committee this term. We did go out to call twice. We are currently in the process of discussing the future of this advisory committee internally with heritage staff, clerks, and the local councillor. So we'll have hopefully next steps on that in the near future. And then there's 3 working groups that I mentioned. So these are not formal subcommittees. They typically have a chair appointed from this committee, but are also made up of citizen volunteers who haven't been appointed by council. So these are typically a good way for folks who maybe want to be involved in heritage matters and maybe cut their teeth, potentially eventually actually apply to be formally appointed to one of our main committees. And these working groups typically do work in a little bit more detail and then provide advice up through this committee for ratification. The Policy and Design Working Group typically reviews heritage impact assessments or other types of assessments as a part of Planning Act or Environmental Assessment Act projects. The Inventory and Research Working Group in the past used to review all of our detailed cultural heritage assessments for designation, although we've recently had some changes to that process. But they've also done their own project work, including new inventories of places of worship, places of education, as well as identifying individual properties potentially for protection or recognition. And then there's the Education and Communication Working Group, and this working group, among its roles, helps coordinate the Heritage Awards every year, and also takes on additional special projects. Currently, there's the last term of the working group was also looking at potentially revamping our Heritage Designation plaquing program. Okay. Shifting gears, a little bit of an intro to heritage planning in Ontario. So municipalities are tasked with ensuring that significant cultural heritage resources are conserved under the Planning Act and its provincial policy statement. And the Ontario Heritage Act is the main tool that we have available to us to accomplish this goal. And that's the act that establishes this committee and that you folks would be providing advice on. And the 2 main ways in which we can protect and conserve cultural heritage resources, we can protect them by designating them or establishing heritage easements, and then being able to manage change to them through the heritage permit process. Or we can also recognize properties through listing on the register and providing interim protection. I will note, though, there are other applicable legislations and acts that do also have cultural heritage policies and that can be interrelated with these. And when we talk about a cultural heritage resource, what are those? We typically talk about the ABCs: archaeology, built heritage, and cultural heritage landscapes. This particular committee primarily deals with built heritage and cultural heritage landscapes, although occasionally you might deal with archaeology maybe as a part of a designation or a heritage district. And built heritage can be thought of as the above ground heritage resources: buildings, structures, monuments, or potentially installations or relics or remains of structures. And then cultural heritage landscapes can be thought of, again, as above ground, but groupings of different elements, whether that's buildings, the space between them, archaeological sites, and even natural elements like mature vegetation. And probably the easiest way to think about a heritage, cultural heritage landscape is our heritage conservation districts. Those could be thought of as landscapes that we've identified having a unique value and have been protected and designated under the Heritage Act. And then just quickly in terms of what heritage conservation is, I keep saying conservation. Generally, this is about understanding and respecting our history. This includes traditional materials and construction techniques. It can be about preventative maintenance. So heritage doesn't have to be about expensive restoration work. Good heritage conservation really starts with preventing a building from deteriorating to the point that it needs major rehabilitation. Conservation is also about minimal intervention. So usually the most cost-effective approach to conserving or restoring a building is using existing materials or replacing with like materials. And as a general rule, we try to repair original features and avoid any permanent damage rather than replacing them. And why do we conserve heritage buildings? Well, probably preaching to the choir here. I'll just touch on a few, though. Really, they're tangible reminders of our history and our past. They provide a sense of place, a unique identity. You may have heard that the greenest building is the one that's already built. And finally, heritage is a public good. Our province has identified, as I mentioned, cultural heritage as something that we as municipalities are tasked with conserving. And although most heritage buildings are privately owned, each owner's occupation of those homes is just one small role in its overall lifetime. So the conservation of these significant resources ensures that they're there for future generations to enjoy. And there is a set of criteria that's laid out by the province for determining what a heritage building is or a heritage property that might be worthy of potential recognition or designation. And I just wanted to highlight that this doesn't just include design value. So there are things like craftsmanship and obviously design that we look at when we're looking at a potential heritage property. But we also consider historical associations and contextual value as well. So it's not necessarily just about grand Victorian buildings, although they are beautiful and we love them, but modern architecture, worker housing, industrial buildings, and bridges may also have heritage value that's worth recognition and protection. And we might hear the idea of a heritage building thrown around a lot. We often get inquiries from folks trying to understand what the actual status of a property is. Hopefully this diagram, if you're not already familiar, will give you a good sense. So you can think of our inventory as sort of the larger database of information we have on all heritage properties. There is no legal status to being listed on our inventory. It's just a recognition that at some point there's been some heritage interest identified in a property. And right now we have just under 7,000 properties on the city's inventory. Then you can see that we move from that to the Municipal Heritage Register. These are properties that have been screened and have been determined to be of sufficient cultural heritage value or interest to list on that register. And this does require a council approval to list. And right now we have just over 2,000 properties listed on the register. And then we have designated or protected properties. And these are properties that have been formally evaluated and either designated or might be subject to potentially heritage conservation easement. And right now in Hamilton, we have just under 650 of those properties. And I'll just briefly touch on each of these different types or statuses of properties. So again, the inventory. This is really our first step to figure out what we have and where it is. It's an information tool that allows us to make decisions related to heritage conservation, whether that's listing on the register, designation, informing planning matters, education or interpretation measures, and potentially even our funding programs. And as I mentioned, there's just under 7,000 inventoried properties across the city, and this really reflects over 40 years of data and research that's been compiled by not just staff, but previously LACAX, the predecessor to you folks here in Heritage Committee today. Next, we have the register. So this is a heritage conservation management tool under the Ontario Heritage Act. It does consist of a record of properties that have been designated under Parts 4 or 5 of the Act, as well as non-designated properties that have been listed by Council as being of heritage interest. And in terms of those listed non-designated properties, by being added to the list, it helps us prioritize potential future designations and provides interim protection from demolition, which I'll touch on in a second. And I will note for those members who are returning or who might have been following legislative changes in recent past, we have been forced to take a bit more of a strategic approach to how we list properties on the register as a result of the recent Bill 23 changes to the Heritage Act. So you will see on these agendas monthly proactive listing reports where we might have prescribed events or potential future changes to properties that we need to proactively list them in case we need to take some sort of action to potentially designate and protect them. And there's also been some changes in terms of we're no longer able to just have properties listed on the register as long as we might need them to be. There are now 2-year expiries to listing, as well as 5-year restrictions on relisting after those expiries. And then that interim protection I mentioned for listed properties. So under the Ontario Heritage Act, if a property is listed on the register, an owner is required to give 60 days advance notice to City Council of their intention to demolish or remove any building or structure on that property. And this is separate from the building permit process. And this is intended to give heritage staff time to hopefully discuss alternatives to demolition, potentially bring forward a recommendation to designate if the property is significant, as that would be the only way to prevent demolition from taking place. And in some cases, we might actually just look to potentially have it documented or get a record before allowing demolition. And a building permit can't be issued until the end of that 60-day period. Little bit of a process diagram for you here. So the Heritage Act does require now for a property to be listed, it does need to meet at least one criteria, something we refer to as Regulation 906 under the Ontario Heritage Act. We have to consult with you folks before a property is listed. Council is ultimately the decision body in terms of what gets listed. And we now give notice to owners of council's decision to list. And that triggers an opportunity for an owner to object to being listed on the register. And as I mentioned again, owners are also required to give that 60 days notice of their intention to demolish. Okay, and then the final heritage statuses, talking about protected heritage properties, including designated properties. So this is protection for significant heritage properties, and we protect them by a bylaw that's registered on title. And we can designate properties under Part 4 individually, or as a part of heritage conservation districts under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act. When we designate properties, we identify what's of value and what attributes or features contribute to that value. And then that provides us a framework for managing change to them through the heritage permit process to ensure that any changes are minimizing potential impact to those features. And designation serves to help recognize the importance of a property to the community, to identify and protect that heritage value that I mentioned, to encourage good stewardship and conservation, and to promote knowledge and understanding about the property to the development or the history of a community. And as I mentioned, there's those criteria that that are set out by the province for determining whether a property is eligible for both listing, as I mentioned before, and designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. And recent changes have now required a property to meet at least 2 of the criteria to be eligible to be individually designated. There are 9 criteria in that regulation, generally broken down into 3 categories that deal with the design physical value, the historical associative value, and contextual value. And you'll see 2 good examples of that later today on the agenda when Scott presents on the 2 recommendations to designate. And this is probably something that'll be helpful to go back to moving forward, but with all of the legislative changes we've seen to the Act recently, we have a couple of points in the designation process in which owners or the public could potentially object or appeal to being designated. So it starts with evaluating and determining a property actually meets the criteria. We consult with you folks on recommendations to designate. Council also ultimately makes it a decision and provides direction of whether we do designate a property. We then issue a notice of intention to designate on behalf of council, which is served on the owner, the Ontario Heritage Trust, who keeps records across the entire province, as well as serving public notice of an intention to designate a property. There's then a 30-day objection period where an owner or any member of the public can object to the notice having been served. If no objections are received, or if council does receive some objections but still proceeds with wanting to designate the property, a bylaw is then passed. And similarly, there's another process of giving notice of that passing on the owner, publicly, and to the Ontario Heritage Trust. And that then starts a second appeal or objection period for 30 days, which is then appealed directly to the Ontario Land Tribunal, who would then hear any appeals and make a decision. And if there were no appeals, or if the OLT supports the designation, we can then actually register a bylaw on title. So it's a bit of a long process. When people ask why designation takes as long as it does, that's a good indication of why. And then just a little bit of information in terms of the designated properties that we have in Hamilton. We have just under 300 individually designated properties, and we also have just under 350 properties within 7 heritage conservation districts across the city. And as I mentioned, we might also protect a significant heritage property by negotiating a heritage easement agreement. It's very similar to designation in terms of needing approvals to make changes to the features that have been identified as being significant to that property. We as a municipality can negotiate easements, but there might also be easements between a property owner and the province as well. And we do have a select few properties that only have heritage easements, but a lot of our early designations back before the Heritage Act actually prevented demolition. Here in Hamilton, we had a lot of our early designations also receive provincial easements. And I'll just quickly note, again, to summarize sort of these different heritage statuses and what it actually means in terms of building permits and being able to make changes to properties. Inventoried properties that are just on our database or list, there's no applicable law for building permits, so there's no ability to prevent or delay the issuance of anything. For listed non-designated properties on the register, there's that 60-day delay that I mentioned. That's just for demolition of buildings or structures. There's no applicable law as it relates to changes or modifications to buildings. And then for designated properties that have been protected, in addition to requiring heritage permits, that's also applicable law for building permits. So they would need heritage permit approvals or a confirmation that one wasn't needed for a scope of work before someone could get a building permit. And then in terms of what heritage permits are, so as I mentioned, once we designate a property, owners then need to get heritage permits to make changes to the features that are protected on that property. There is no cost to a heritage permit application. This process is intended to ensure that any changes are minimizing any adverse impacts to what makes that property significant and of value. And we look at things like displacement effects as well as disruption effects. And in terms of when a heritage permit might be required for individual properties, we look specifically to the bylaw that protects it. For older bylaws, there might be something referred to as a reasons for designation in terms of why that property has value. And more recent bylaws, we actually have a specific list of attributes required, and we manage change to any physical impacts proposed to those attributes. For our heritage conservation districts, what we look for is basically any changes proposed to the exterior of buildings or landscapes within the district that are visible from the public right-of-way. There's also certain requirements for districts, and you folks will primarily see these types of applications, like when demolition or removal of building is proposed within a heritage district, or the construction of a new building is proposed within a heritage district. And all of the changes within these districts are managed by their individual Heritage Conservation District plans, which are tailored to identifying what's significant within those districts and what we're trying to manage and prevent adverse effects to. And just some examples of types of things that require a heritage permit. So obviously significant additions or demolitions, but even down to major landscaping that might be proposed, or even the installation of venting or dormers or skylights. So if yourselves or any of the members of the public who are listening who might own designated properties, when in doubt, reach out to staff, have a discussion, and confirm if you need a heritage permit. As we touched on earlier, all heritage permits are reviewed by the Permit Review Subcommittee, which is another council-appointed subcommittee. We receive advice from that subcommittee before we continue to process those permits. We do have some timelines under the Heritage Act. Once we receive a complete application, we do have 90 days as a municipality to make a decision, and that could be consenting or approving to a permit, consenting with conditions, or potentially refusing a permit. However, most of the applications that we receive are alteration permits, so just changes, no significant impacts to the properties. And we can typically approve these through the delegated authority of council. So after we review them with permit review, we can issue delegated approval letters. And you'll see those, for example, today on your agenda as consent items for you to receive for your information. And then, as I mentioned, there's certain types of applications that can't be delegated and that come up through you folks before going to Planning Committee and Council. And this includes things like demolishing buildings or heritage attributes and new construction in heritage districts. As well, staff cannot refuse an application if there's a recommendation to refuse or a disagreement between ourselves, yourselves, or permit review. It does need to go to council for a final decision. And just so you're aware, we do have some standard conditions that we usually attach to heritage permits. We typically have a condition that allows for any minor changes just to come back through staff, so people don't have to go back through the entire process if relatively minor changes are needed, maybe come up through the building permit process. We also typically use a 2-year expiry on all of our heritage permits, although sometimes you might see a longer expiry if a project's anticipated to take quite a long time. And then there's also the opportunity to add other conditions to heritage permit approvals, maybe ensuring that they are required to get any other approvals that might be needed, allowing for final design to come back through staff, and probably another most common one is ensuring that any masonry work is in accordance with our city masonry restoration guidelines. So just wrapping up here, just wanted to touch on a little bit of our proactive heritage inventory work. So we do have a public list of candidates for Part 4 designation. So these are properties that have been flagged as being potentially significant enough to be protected. And with those recent Bill 23 changes that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we've changed our process and we now have a high priority list that staff are attempting to review by January 1st, 2025 of 60 properties. And this is in relation to properties that will be expiring and being removed from the register on that date. And we're also in the process of identifying new designation candidates and then adding them to this public list or immediately going forward to designation if there's an immediate threat like a prescribed event. Other proactive heritage work we're doing is we are tasked with reporting back through you folks into council in the new year with a new Heritage Conservation District strategy and work plan. So we haven't actually designated a new heritage district in over 23 years. We do have one ongoing in Melville, on Melville Street in Dundas currently. But we had been doing our proactive work by listing on the register before all these legislative changes. So in light of those changes and the fact that we can't just keep properties on the register anymore, we need to sort of pivot how we're approaching our proactive work and looking at shifting towards the identification and protection of new heritage districts across the city. And we do have a preliminary list of areas that have been flagged through previous work. The 3 that are bolded here are areas that we've actually been given council direction to prepare a heritage district study for. So those will be the priorities once we get that new process in place. And I'll just highlight that information on the candidates for designation is public and online. There's individual mapping that identifies where all of these properties are, and this is to assist property owners and also prospective purchasers so they know what expectations might be for their properties. And we also have really detailed heritage resource mapping that identifies properties and their status. For those who are familiar with this, in yellow are properties that are inventoried. In orange, shown here, are properties that are listed on the register, and in purple are designated. And you can see areas where we've done proactive inventory work in the past here in the Durand neighborhood, where we've done a significant number of listings. And this also reflects areas that when we do new heritage districts, we'll want to focus on because we've identified concentrations of properties that are worthy of protection. And last but not least, Once we protect properties and designate them, yes, we can manage change, but we also want to try to promote and encourage good stewardship and ongoing conservation of those properties. And we do here at the City of Hamilton have a pretty robust suite of financial incentives available for designated properties, including development charge exemption. This can help assist with the adaptive reuse of buildings and properties. We have a number of grant programs. The Hamilton Heritage Property Grant Program is one of our much larger ones and focuses on multi-residential, commercial, institutional properties. We have a smaller conservation grant program that's focused more so on sort of ongoing maintenance work for single-family residential properties. And then we also have a substantial loan program that's available, 10-year interest-free loan of up to $40,000, which can really assist folks when they might have a really big price tag in front of them and need some assistance to be able to do that work. Thank you for sitting through. I know that it was a lot, and I know most of you are returning, but it's helpful, I think, even for the public record and anyone listening to just really understand what you folks do, what you help advise on. More information can be found here on a lot of the stuff that I touched on, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have at this point.
Thank you, Alyssa. That was a great presentation. If we can start a speakers list for questions. I saw Karen's hand. Graham, did you have any? Go ahead, Karen.
Thank you. Just a little process question. So if somebody makes an objection to the notice of intent to designate, or they do that second step, the appeal, is that public? Is that known by people who, like by our committee and general public?
Yeah, good question, Karen. I'll just pull up that slide, if that would be helpful. So the short answer is yes. So depending on which stage they are objecting at. So the first objection period after we issue a notice of intention to designate, the Act requires council to reconsider whether or not they should withdraw their notice or not. So it has to go to council. So that would be a public process. We would receive that objection and we would report to council about that objection. And then they would make a decision of whether or not to withdraw their notice or to proceed with designating. The second appeal period, once we pass a bylaw, that appeal is to the Ontario Land Tribunal. We would, although we haven't had one of those in a while, I'm just trying to think, we would typically, there would be correspondence about that appeal, and that would at least be made public. And then any decision that comes out of that, we would also report through this committee and up to Planning Committee and Council. And at any point, even if we haven't yet gotten to the point where we've reported, if there was an inquiry, we would share that information. We would obviously keep this committee up to date on active files as well.
Are there any other questions about the report? Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to give others a chance. So this is more of a current process question. So with this Cross Melville working group, that apparently there wasn't enough interest in, and they didn't get enough people who volunteered to participate in that. I'm just wondering how that reach out was done, because I mean, I live in Dundas, and I don't think I even saw a notice about that. I mean, perhaps there was one in the original posting, which I would have read in the newspaper, but I don't even think people get newspapers anymore. So I'm just wondering how it is we reach out for these committees other than that.
Good thing I'm here. Lorraine Kohler from the Clerk's Office. I was the lead on the recruitment to all our subcommittees, agencies, and boards. So the information about Cross Melville was given the same information went out on all our subcommittees. So the Cross Melville was included on all our lists, in all our communications. And so that's the answer to the question. That's the answer, I think.
And so it's not done by like Facebook or anything?
Yes, so
is
the
it?
city uses a lot of social media now.
Okay.
We also have various group distribution lists that we send out to different groups. So the information has been, to the best of our abilities, put out there for people to see.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, if we can put forward a motion, I need a mover and a seconder to receive the presentation.
I see Graham and I see Stefan.
Okay. And as we move to vote, is there anyone opposed to receiving? I see none. That item is carried. Thank you again for that presentation, Melissa. We're moving on to item 8.2 is our recommendation to designate 176 Wilson Street East in Ancaster, known as Birch Lawn, under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, PED 23241 in Ward 12. So we have Scott Dickinson, Cultural Heritage Planning Technician, and Alyssa Golden, Program Lead, will be here. They're going to be giving us a presentation on this.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Dickinson. I'm the Cultural Heritage Planning Technician for the city. If this is your first designation presentation, don't worry, it's mine too. We're reporting on PED 23241, Agenda Item 8.2, our recommendation to designate 176 Wilson Street East, Ancaster. This property is located at the western end of the village core of Ancaster, just opposite the corner of Wilson Street East and Daly Drive, which you can see here on the location map. Brief bit of background, this property was first surveyed by the Ancaster LACAC in the 1970s for heritage interest. More recently, in June of 2020, it was listed on the Heritage Register and put on staff's designation work plan. And of course, in the spring of this year, as a response to the changes wrought by Bill 23, it was reprioritized for designation by January 1st, 2025. Staff have been in contact with the owners of this property. We have advised them of our recommendation to designate, and the owners have communicated with us that they do have some concerns about designation. They are concerned that it may affect their insurance rates, that it may complicate the sale of their property, which they are contemplating. However, staff do recommend designation under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, as this property meets 4 of the 9 criteria under Ontario Regulation 906. This 2-story brick house, built circa 1881, is a representative example of Italianate architecture. Some of the more typical features it exhibits, the trunnicated hip roof, the projecting eaves with paired wooden brackets, the projecting 3-sided bays on the front and side of the house with polygonal roofs, and the decorative dichromatic brick elements, the prominent quoins, the window hoods, and the brick paneling under those prominent eaves. Thanks to these features, it also is considered to display a high degree of craftsmanship. This property does not, however, meet any of the historical or associative value criteria. But it is considered important in supporting the historic character of Wilson Street East. This large former farmhouse, which you can see is rather hidden by the modern developments around it, at least from this angle. It does mark the western boundary of the historic village of Ancaster, so it's sort of the western entrance into the village itself. It is also historically linked to its surroundings, being on its original location, and again, marking that western entrance into the core. These criteria are summarized in this Statement of Cultural Heritage Value or Interest. This is a shortened version. The full version is in the attached report in Appendix B. And of course, this will go into informing a potential designation bylaw, which would list the following heritage attributes, including the hip roof with projecting eaves and wooden brackets, the brick chimney, the front and side projecting bays, the window openings with brick hoods and stone lug sills, the wood windows with storms, the front door and its transom, and of course that dichromatic brickwork, as well as its contextual attribute as it's located fronting onto Wilson Street East. Now, if there are any questions at this time.
Do we have any questions for Scott? See Karen? Go ahead, Karen.
Thank you. Am I supposed to say through the chair every time I ask a question? Yes, okay, through the chair. Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. I actually went out and looked at the house yesterday, and it is beautiful, right? And it's so well taken care of. Like, it's just, so my question is, do we have information, I'm sure I've heard this before, where realtors have said, no, actually, there is no negative impact of having a designation. That doesn't ever impact negatively the sales value of your property. Is that correct? We have that? Thank you.
Through the chair to Karen. So yes, we do hear that a lot. We have information on our website that speaks to the fact that there isn't an empirical data study analysis that confirms any negative correlation between property designation and resale value. Obviously, every individual situation is different depending on what someone's proposing for a property. If something is protected and they're proposing demolition, that's going to impact what their plans are for that property. We recently actually undertook a detailed Hamilton-specific study with students at McMaster University. It was published earlier this year. We haven't yet updated our information on our site, but it looked at Hamilton-specific data and similarly did not find any negative correlation. There was typically a positive correlation, but not necessarily a confirmation of why that is positive and if it's designation itself that is causing that, or there's so many other factors that impact property value. So long-winded answer, but no. So there's no direct studies or information that actually confirms a negative correlation.
Do we have any other questions for Scott? No? Oh, go ahead, Graham.
Well done on your first presentation.
You did an excellent job. Are there any other questions? And that's how you know you did a good job on the presentation. All right, so we will move on to, we need to receive the presentation. May I have a mover and a seconder?
I see Graham and I see Andrew.
Okay, and as we move to vote on receiving the presentation, do we have any objection? Seeing none opposed, that item is carried, and we move on to the report. So we have before us the report. Is there any discussion in regards to the report? If not, may I have a mover and a seconder to put the recommendations on the floor? So the recommendation before us is that the city clerk be directed to give notice of the council's intention to designate 176 Wilson Street East in Ancaster.
I saw Andy and I saw Karen.
Okay, and are there any questions of the report? Seeing none, as we move to vote on the recommendations before us, is there anyone opposed? Seeing none, that item is carried. We move on to item 8.3 is the recommendation to designate 241 Wilson Street East in Ancaster, the former Ancaster Carriage Company factory under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, PED 23192, Ward 12. Scott, you're back up for another presentation.
All right, once again, Scott Dickinson, Cultural Heritage Planning Technician. This time we're looking at report PED 23192, item 8.3 on your agenda, a recommendation to designate 241 Wilson Street East, Ancaster. Which you can see here, this property is also located at the western edge of the village core in Ancaster, at the intersection of Wilson Street East and Halston Drive. If you're familiar with the area, it's just across the way from St. John's Anglican Church. As you can see here in the upper photograph from the 1940s, when it was being used as an apartment building. And the map image is actually part of a fire insurance map from 1885, which was very interesting to find. We didn't know Ancaster had a fire insurance map until a couple months ago. Brief background, this property was first surveyed for heritage interest by the Ancaster LACAC in the 1970s. And more recently, in June of 2020, it was listed on the register and placed on staff's work plan. And of course, this past spring, it was reprioritized for designation by January 1st, 2025, in response to Bill 23. We have been in contact with the owners of this property, and they are very enthusiastic about designation. Though they send their regrets, they're in Florida right now, otherwise they would have attended. Now, we recommend designation under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, as this property meets 5 of the 9 criteria as laid out under Regulation 906. It is a representative example of a vernacular stone structure used for industrial purposes in the 19th century. It has an L-shaped plan with a cross-gable roof, single-stack chimneys, an irregular pattern of windows with stone voussoirs, rubble stone walls with dressed stone quoins, and a stone foundation. This property has direct associations with a lot of 19th century Ancaster industry. On the spot where the building stands, the Eggleston brothers, Alonzo and Harris, operated a machine shop, one of their many Ancaster industries, and they would sell this machine shop to long-serving lawyer Edward Kenrick, who operated the Ancaster Carriage Company out of that structure, until it burned down, at which point it was replaced with the current building in 1885. Unfortunately, Mr. Kenrick decided to wind up his business after only a few years, and instead decided to convert his factory into residential and, well, space for residential and commercial tenants. And we know it was being rented out by the late 1890s. This property is considered to have the potential to yield information that contributes to an understanding of Ancaster as a community. This building had a very short life in its intended purpose and has spent, well, since 1900 or so, being used for other purposes, for residential and currently commercial uses. You might think of it as a very early example of adaptive reuse, pardon me. It does define the historic character of this part of Ancaster. As you can see from the streetscape, this industrial building is very close to St. John's Anglican Church, and just out of sight is the Ancaster Old Town Hall. This was not some isolated site. In the 19th century, Ancaster's industry was cheek by jowl with its places of recreation, its homes, and of course its religious centers. It is also visually and historically linked to its surroundings. There are several modern buildings on either side of it, but they have been built in a very sympathetic manner to emphasize the industrial nature of this part of Ancaster, of this part of Wilson Street East. And of course, it is very close to a number of designated structures. The foregoing is summarized here. Of course, the full statement of cultural heritage value or interest is in Appendix B of the attached report, and this will inform a designation bylaw once we get to that point. Such a bylaw would list these heritage attributes, including its L-shaped plan, the cross-gable roof, the single-stack red brick chimneys, the rubble stone walls with dressed quoins, the segmentally arched windows in a regular pattern, the side entrance on the east with its transom and the stone foundation, as well as contextual attributes, its location fronting onto Wilson Street East, and its extreme visibility from the public right-of-way.
Thank you again, Scott. Do we have any questions for the presentation? Go ahead, Graham.
Out of curiosity, does anyone know why the Ancaster Lac Act didn't designate this building back in the 70s?
Through the chair, not offhand. I will say a great deal of early survey work was done. We have volumes of previous LACAC reports and studies. If it's anything similar to what former City of Hamilton proper was like, a lot of the time it was reactionary. So if there maybe wasn't any immediate threat or concern, that maybe didn't get the priority at the time. But yeah, a lot of significant properties still yet to be designated in Ancaster that we have early LACAC research reports for to help assist with.
Are there any other questions? Okay, so may I have a mover and a seconder to receive the presentation?
I see Graham and I see Stefan.
And as we move to vote, is there anyone opposed to receiving the presentation? Seeing none, that item is carried, and we move on to the report. So we have the report before us with the recommendation that the city clerk be directed to give notice of council's intention to designate 241 Wilson Street East in Ancaster. May I have a mover and a seconder to put that recommendation on the floor?
I see Andy and I see Andrew.
And before we move to vote, are there any questions? Seeing none, we'll move to vote. Is there anyone opposed? Seeing none, that item is carried. Thank you, everyone. And we move on to our consent items. So before us, we have consent items 9.1, 9.2, and 9.3. We have a mover and a seconder to put those consent items on the floor.
I see Lynn and I see Andrew.
So with those items, are there any questions? Go ahead, Graham.
This 9.1, the Less Red Tape Act, what was the driving force with this? I don't really see it ever being a problem because there's so few designated properties that are religious.
Through the chair, so attached to the report is the actual registry posting and information. This was a part of a bill, Bill 139, that included a number of other schedules and changes to other acts in addition to the Ontario Heritage Act. There's no specific identification of intent other than to try to streamline the process for properties that are used for religious practices as a part of the heritage permit process. So if they're proposing to make an alteration that relates to their religious practices, that those be automatically consented to. But there's no larger sort of philosophical intent identified within the posting and these draft amendments.
Because reading through this is bad planning. They can just claim whatever they want and it gets done. We lose heritage attributes like crazy. I just don't understand it. It floored me when I read this report.
Through the chair, I might note, so the proposal for these changes to the act to streamline these types of heritage permits are just for alterations. So it doesn't include the demolition of designated properties that are used for religious purposes. And as staff note in the information report, there's some ambiguity in terms of the interpretation of religious practices. There's reference to the property owners' congregations or places of worship that run out of those properties providing an affidavit and a confirmation of that. But there's still some ambiguity in terms of what would constitute a religious practice. So depending on auxiliary uses or other types of things that an organization might be using the property for and whether that would fall under those practices. So we did pose those questions, at least in this information report, and do plan on including those questions back to the province as a part of our submission.
Are there any other questions in regards to this item? Seeing none, we'll move on to vote for the consent items. Is there anyone opposed? Seeing none, that item is carried. Item 10.1 is the establishment of our working group memberships. So as was discussed in Alyssa's presentation, we have 3 working groups where over the course of our term, much of the work that this committee reviews and does happens at that working group level. So at this time, we would like to get members that will be volunteering for these working groups. If members are not prepared to do so today, we can defer this item until the next meeting if anyone would like some clarification. But I think they would like to establish those groups so we could move ahead with meetings coming up shortly. So we have, I'm not sure what's the best way to do this, if just individual members want to state if they'd like to be a member, we can go group by group. Go ahead, Alyssa.
Through the chair, I could just put up the description of the working groups so folks can take a look at that again and deliberate.
Go ahead, Karen.
Okay, I had a question. It seems that our committee is a lot smaller than it used to be. And I'm not sure why that is or whether we're going to hear exactly why it is. Because I think last time, did we have 11 members? And now we have 7? So, and we're still tasked with doing the same amount of work, or, well, that's more per person, but what I was wondering is, do we need to therefore, well, if I could have an answer to that, that would be great, but do we also need to revisit these working groups and say, well, maybe we only need 2 of them and certain things can be left behind or, you know, conglomerated, whatever the word is. You know, amalgamated, thank you. So just put that out there, if we could discuss a bit. Thank you.
Yes, through the chair, you can certainly amend your working groups if you decide maybe that they're not as relevant or you're taking on too much of a task load. We can amend the terms of reference too. We can put forward a motion to dissolve one of the working groups if that is the will of committee. If that's what you're suggesting, I think, Karen, maybe, but.
Through the chair, I was going to note from staff's perspective, I had mentioned during the introductory presentation that some of the previous role of inventory and research, for example, we used to bring all of our detailed heritage designation evaluation reports through that working group. That function does not exist anymore. So if there isn't necessarily an appetite to be undertaking self-directed inventory work at this time, then that working group potentially could at least temporarily dissolve and reestablish if there is a project you want to initiate again or start a new project within. And then in terms of policy and design, something that we're still evaluating the impact of the changes, but again, the Bill 23 changes to not just the Heritage Act, but the Planning Act has changed our timelines in terms of how we get feedback on heritage impact assessment reports that might be submitted as a part of Planning Act applications. So it is potential that maybe there isn't the same role for that particular working group. It doesn't mean it couldn't be established, but it might not need to meet, at least from a staff perspective or a staff-initiated component as often, unless there were special projects, again, that working group might want to work on. In the past, that policy and design working group has brought forward, for example, the masonry restoration guidelines were developed through that working group. So there could still be special projects beyond what staff might be bringing as well.
Do we have any other questions, or Karen has a second time speaker? So Councillor Crutch first and then Karen. Go ahead, Councillor.
I was just going to flag the question that Karen asked about the change in the composition of the committee. Just to get an answer on that, just so folks know, I've only ever declared 2 conflicts of interest in my time at council, and those were only for people who I knew or had a socially significant relationship with that were applying to committees, so I didn't participate in some of the committee selection. And so I don't have a lot of insight as to the answer to that question. Normally you could ask that question, I could give you a pretty good answer because I'm on the selection committee, but in this case, I had a conflict of interest with somebody who applied who so I'm not really privy to that information. I think your question stands as to wanting to know why the number is different. So just putting that out there into the ether, that I think it's good to get that on the record as to why the number is different.
Selection committee deliberates their applications and makes their decisions in closed session. So I'm unable to give you any answer on that.
May I ask one more question? So through the chair. Also, I think this was mentioned before about working group members who are not actually on this committee. And I'm just wondering, would they have to have been people who were interviewed for this committee, or they could just be anybody? And so it's still a possibility that we could get more people on these committees if we somehow reached out and asked if people wanted to participate in those? Is that correct? Or do we basically have our pool of people right now?
So there's an excellent couple of paragraphs in the procedural handbook that we've given all the new members that lays out how a working group can work. They're ad hoc groups, and if the working group knows of need or requires someone from the outside of the committee membership that would be a good addition to it, then they join the working group.
Okay, thank you.
And just building on that, as I mentioned in my presentation, it can often be a great way we might meet people at public events or other interested folks, property owners who care about heritage and want to learn more about what this committee does, and often inviting them to potentially attend and participate in some of these volunteer-driven working groups can be a great way for them to cut their teeth and learn more and maybe eventually actually apply to be on this committee.
Do we have any further questions? So I guess a couple of things. Are we considering reviewing the working groups that we have and looking to adjust those? Or are we moving forward with initial meetings to see, once the groups get together, if they'd like to amend? Go ahead, Karen.
Through the chair, my thoughts on that, I think that's probably a good idea. Convene the group, see what the mandate is and whether people think there is enough to do or it's overwhelming or whichever. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Decide instead of deciding right here, right now.
So are you suggesting hosting a meeting and those that want to attend?
I think so. Yeah.
Is there work coming forward for those two working groups? Education, we always have items that we can discuss, and we have the awards ongoing. The other two working groups, is there any upcoming meetings planned?
Through the chair, so for inventory and research, again, we don't have a formal mechanism and don't have anything that we as staff need to bring through that working group anytime soon. There was the ongoing project work of the previous term of that working group that was also in a little bit of limbo with all of the legislative changes. So there was the places of worship review. That is something that staff could finish on our end and bring back through this main committee in terms of final recommendations. So that doesn't necessarily have to take place at the working group level if that were to be dissolved or not formed. And policy and design, there's no legal requirement for the review of heritage impact assessments or other types of assessments by the working group as a part of the Planning Act process. It can just be helpful input. So we can still continue to process Planning Act applications without that additional input, although it can be valuable. We've chatted about that internally in terms of, getting an additional set of eyes and having the working group members provide feedback that we can relay to applicants to really help hit home maybe what we as staff are already saying. So there's definitely value in there, although not a legislative requirement for that review.
So maybe what we should do is we'll go group by group. If we can get a list of people that are at least interested in that outline of what the group is involved with, and then we can take the next steps to, even if we don't formally form them as groups just yet, but at least it gives us a basis to start to move forward and get a group together, okay? So education and communication working group is the first one on our agenda list. So education and communication is looking at public outreach. It's looking at the publications that we do, handouts, things like that, what we do when we go out to events. And the main focus is our heritage recognition awards. So do we have any members of the new Municipal Heritage Committee that would like to take part in that working group? That is one that I had in the past term chaired. So you can add myself to that. Karen quietly said she would consider that one. Oh, I see Stefan's hand. So we meet, typically it's the first Wednesday of every month for that meeting, and it's from 6 till 8 o'clock. Any other members? So that we'll use that as our starting list. Inventory and research working group. Again, they're looking at evaluations of properties, inventory properties. Councillor?
Just to clarify, you said when does that meeting meet? The first Wednesday of what?
Education is first Wednesday of each month.
And that is the, for also helping with the awards?
Yes.
Right, I'd be happy to participate in that. I'm just not sure if we could talk about the availability in terms of the meeting date. That might be my only conflict. That's the only group I think I could probably help to join with, so I'll join that.
Okay, no, that's great. Okay, okay. So inventory and research working group. Is there anyone that would be interested in those evaluation of properties? And so we've got Lynn, and I see Andy's hand. And then finally, we have the policy and design working group. So again, as required, looking more at the policy, we've got Andrew and Lynn. And as chair, I would typically attend those meetings, so you can add my name to those. I'm doing it for a while.
Madam Chair, did you want me to just throw that up on the screen just to have a quick review so everyone can see?
Sure, yeah, let's do that. Chair, I would typically attend those meetings, so you can add my name to those. I hear myself. I'm doing it for a while.
Madam Chair, did you want me to just throw that up on the screen?
So while Leah's just updating that list, so for education and communication, our first meeting of this term is going to be December 6th. We typically meet 6 till 8 and virtually. So those staff, make sure that those meeting invites get sent out. And then with the working groups, the working groups, again, as we discussed, membership is open to anyone that's interested in those working groups, but we typically would have a member of the Municipal Heritage Committee is the chair, so that you're then consistently bringing forward any items that come from the working groups. Are there any changes to this list? Right now, we can always revisit it in the next meeting, okay? So may I have a mover and a seconder to approve the working group memberships?
So I see Stefan, I see Andrew.
And as we move to vote, is there anyone opposed? Seeing none, that item is carried. Okay. Item 10.2 is our monthly report on recommended proactive listings for the Municipal Heritage Register, November 2023, PED 23235 and Ward 3. So we have Alyssa, would you like to speak?
Thanks to the chair. So as I mentioned in my introductory presentation, this is one of those monthly proactive listing reports that you might see. Staff don't typically give a formal presentation on these. They're relatively straightforward in terms of we've done a preliminary review. Attached as appendix to the report is the evaluation confirming that it meets at least one criteria under Ontario Regulation 906 to warrant listing. Typically you'll see recommendations to list that are coming out of maybe formal consultation applications where we know there's a subsequent Planning Act application coming. Doesn't mean that it's always doom and gloom and something's going to be demolished, but it could just be a recommendation to list proactively in case there's any change, and we want to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row and can designate if we need to if an application is triggered. In this case, this is for a property at 78 Sturton Street in Hamilton in Ward 3, and happy to answer any questions you might have as Emily is currently on vacation today.
So do we have any questions in regards to the recommendation? No, don't see it. So may I have a mover and a seconder to put the recommendation on the floor?
Oh, I see Andrew and Karen.
And if there's no questions, we'll move to vote on the recommendation before us. Is there anyone opposed? Seeing none, then that item is carried. Under our general information and other business, 13.1 is our buildings and landscapes. So just with, for those new members or We created this list because there was a number of properties that over time were not necessarily, there was some concern that just warranted them being watched. It wasn't required that staff needed to give a formal presentation or update necessarily all the time, but just that a member of this Municipal Heritage Committee walking past, looking at the property just to see if how things were, if there was some concern. At a certain point, it was needed that we had to prioritize this list. So we've given it a color coding system so that we knew what was more higher priority, what was maybe just, it was just a sort of a property that was of interest, and maybe we just keep an eye on it. So you'll notice that we have heritage properties in red, yellow, and green. So that's how we set our priorities, and there is a description as to what each one of those ratings are. What we do ask is that the membership each voluntarily, if you can take on a few properties, just to, and you're not meant to necessarily go out of your way to contact owners, or we don't want you going onto properties. It would just be driving past, or if you're walking down the street, if you want to do a cursory review just to check up on how things are. And at every meeting, we have this list here. It doesn't mean that we talk about each individual property at every meeting, but it is a trigger list for us as a reminder. So if there is a property that you want to give the group an update on, that item is there on the agenda. So what is before us today is the very long list of properties. So maybe what I would first start off with, are there any properties that members did not see on this list that they had wanted to add to the list? Lynn, go ahead.
Yes, through the chair, I would like to add the Eager House at 340 Dundas Street East. It is currently on the register, but it has just gone up for sale. It's very difficult to get photographs of the building as there is so much vegetation around it, even though it is on a corner lot. But the building does not seem to have been added to or substantially changed since it was built in around 1871. It's a Gothic Revival architectural style, and it was family-owned from its inception in 1871 until 1989. The Eager family was very prominent in Waterdown, and I think that it should be just as a caution because it is up for sale. And I would put this under green. And I will watch it.
Thank you, Lynn. We'll get that added to the list. Oh, go ahead.
And through the chair, I'll just note, Lynn had flagged this to staff as well, that this property is up for sale. In addition to being already listed on the register, staff already do have a comprehensive heritage evaluation report and have a pending recommendation to designate. It's on our high priority list. We had deferred that because there was ongoing bridge work. Then there was some dialogue between our colleagues in Public Works and this property owner at the time. So should there be an immediate threat that we're made aware of, we are ready to move forward to designate at any time.
Sounds good. Are there any other properties that members would like to add to the list? Councillor Crouch?
I'm not sure if I'm adding a property to the list or a wrinkle, but with the changeover in membership, there were members on the previous committee who were tasked or named as watchers of these things. I recognize a vulnerability in Ward 2 specifically, meaning that there were at least 2 people who were watching properties in Ward 2. I'll take those on and for now, and I'll talk to my staff about providing a bit of support around watching those, but I don't want them to go on not being on the list. So anything in Ward 2, I'm happy to, for the time being, just take over watching those. Just so we have coverage, if that's okay. Like, I don't know what how formal this is, but anyway.
No, that would be great if you could, because you'll will certainly know those properties really well and get those updates for you. Yeah. No, thank you for doing that. So we'll make that adjustment. So we'll start first if we can have we've got the motion forward to add the property at Eager House. If we can have a seconder, and then we'll vote on adding that to our list. Yeah. So Graham to second.
No, actually, we have another property.
You have another. Okay, so we'll. Do you want to do them as a group or individual?
Let's just do them as a group at the end, seeing as there's multiple properties that we need to add, remove, et cetera. So we'll just take one vote.
Okay. So go ahead, Graham.
It's 210 or 206, 210 King Street East, the former Forbidden City, and I forget the name, the grocery store, it used to be there. I hear it's up for sale. I know it was once a designation candidate and then somehow it fell off the radar. It's on the inventory, not the registry. But with the pending sale, it's going to be kind of under threat. I suggest it's yellow.
Graham, did you want to watch that, or I don't, okay. And do we have any other property additions that members would like to make? Okay, so what we'll do, we'll go through the list of properties, and if I'll stop if I can just have volunteers to address those properties. So we have 80 to 92 Barton Street East, which is the former Hannerhan Hotel, which again is in Ward 2. So Councillor, well, look, but if anyone in additional would like to, then we
If
can.
there's some people who are wildly eager to join in the fun, I would
go
never
ahead.
oppose such an activity, but
Stefan, you'd like to watch that one?
Through the chair, I'm just, I live just down the street. I see that building almost every single day, so I can take that on if that's accepted.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay. We have 1155 to 1157 Beach Boulevard, which is the Beach Canal Lighthouse and Cottage.
No wonder there.
So maybe what we'll do, we'll go through the list, and then we can always follow up next meeting if someone would like to take it on. 66 to 68 Charlton Avenue West.
yeah, I'll take that, sure.
Okay. 71 Claremont Drive, Ackmar Gatehouse and Claremont Lodge.
That's my neighborhood, so.
Graham? Okay. 127 Houston Street North, Firth Brothers Building. So, Councillor. 163 Jackson Street West, Pinehurst. Councillor? Yeah. 108 James Street North, Tivoli. 98 James Street South, the former James Street Baptist Church. 18 to 22 King Street East, the Gore Buildings, and
Yeah.
24 to 28. 378 Main Street East, the Cathedral Boys School.
Ward 3.
That's Ward 3, yeah. Stefan? Yeah. 120 Park Street North. Okay. Then we have, under yellow, we have 574 North Cliff Avenue, which is St. Joseph's Mother House.
Good near you.
Oh, I can do that.
Lynn? Okay. 1 Balfour Drive, Shadoke East, Balfour House. Graham? 384 Barton Street East, St. Paul's Ecumenical Church.
Is that in Ward 2? 34 Barton Street East?
384.
384, that's Ward 3.
Then we have 134 Cannon Street East, which is the Cannon Knitting Mills.
Oh, yeah.
52 Charlton Avenue West, the former Charlton Hall. 5456 Hess Street South. 1 Main Street West, former BMO Gowlings. Was that one going to be removed or removed? There's no longer a threat. Would the membership have any concern with removing Gowlings, or are we keeping Gowlings on? So originally the building was under threat of being sold. Okay. So when we do our recommendations for removal.
Yeah, no one for removal.
Okay. 4 Turner Avenue.
Yes.
Okay. 420 King Street East, St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church.
Ward 3.
Stefan? Okay. 88 Fennel Avenue West, Ackmar.
I'll do that.
Okay, sounds good. 125 King Street East, Norwich Apartments.
Yes, that's me.
206 Main Street West, Arlo House.
Yep.
And 5054 Sanders Boulevard, Binkley property. Karen?
I didn't know.
Oh.
I want to ask a question.
Oh, sure. Okay. Do we have anyone for that last property? 5054 Sanders Boulevard, Binkley property. So another, that could be another one that we'll review next time. Karen, you wanted to ask a question?
I wanted to offer up all the Ancaster properties if anybody wanted them. Since I think I took them over from Tim, I think, and I just wondered if any of our new members wanted them. I'm not sure where everybody's located, so, but if that's a no.
So does that give clerks a start with the list, and we can always make adjustments at our next meeting?
Yeah, through the chair, we can always revisit the list. It's not set in stone, so we can have future volunteers if you want to have an opportunity just to take some time to look at where you're situated and where, you know, the properties are located. That would be okay.
That's a great start. So there was a recommendation to remove Gowlings, and Graham, you wanted an additional?
Yeah, that 384 Barton Street East, was it St. Paul's Ecumenical Church? When it went on, it was more for the building that was coming down or being rebuilt that was beside it, more in the concern of the actual places of worship. So I don't even know why it's still on the list. Like, that could come off.
Which one is it?
384 Barton Street East.
What number? Red and blue?
It's under yellow.
Number 9.
Alyssa?
Through the chair, and I'll just note that that property is already designated as well, so there is that protection already in place as well.
So Graham, did you want to recommend that that property be removed from the list?
Yeah, I don't see any threat anymore. So the building beside is gone. No.
Okay.
Through the chair, so if Graham is moving the removal of 384 Barton Street East, you also put forward, Graham, a removal of 1 Main Street West, the Gowlings building. So we could just do that as one motion. If we need a seconder for that, Councillor Kretsch.
Does that motion also include the additions, or are you just doing removals?
Just removals, Madam Chair, and then we'll do a separate for.
So we have the motion, the mover and a seconder. Is there anyone opposed to removing those two properties? Seeing none, that item is carried. Then we have the addition of Eager House and 210 King Street East. Do you have a seconder for, can we have a seconder for those properties? Okay. And as we go to add those properties, is there any opposition? Anyone opposed? Oh, second. Anyone opposed? Saying no? Okay. Okay, and that item is carried. And do you need a motion for the whole, to receive the whole list, or just?
Oh, through the chair, I thought that was for the additions and for the whole list.
Okay.
So
Oh, that's perfect.
Lynn moved and Graham seconded for the additions and the entire list.
Perfect, all right. Wonderful. So I think that brings us to staff updates. Are there any updates from staff? Go ahead, Graham. New business?
Okay. So Alyssa was dying to say something when I was bringing up 210 King Street East. Was there something you know that I should know?
Through the chair, I just was going to say that staff have been in touch with the listing agents, so we've made them aware of the heritage interest in the property. There's a bit of history on this one. It was supposed to be listed on the register as a part of the downtown inventory. It was ultimately tabled because there was some concern by the owners at the time. And then you may recall in our Bill 23 report earlier this year, because that recommendation to list was outstanding on the outstanding business list item. And because of the changes to the act, it didn't make sense to add it to the register when it was just going to be removed. So it's exciting to see some potential change and new life into this property. We have had some conversations that have been productive, so hopefully there's some interest in someone purchasing it who wants to adaptively reuse this building and revitalize that corner.
Go ahead, Ken. Staff updates, yep. Oh, I'm sorry. That's something to talk about. I apologize, I did not see you. Go ahead, Lynn, it's very important.
It is, thank you, through the chair. I wanted to just do an update on the former West Flamborough Township Hall at 238 Brock Road. It's under yellow number 6. There are some photographs here which were given to me last year. After COVID, some of the occupants were allowed to go back in. I don't believe that city staff had visited this vacant designated heritage building at all. There's about 5 or 6 photos, I believe, which show the holes in the roof, the damage that was done with water to the ceiling and all of the plasterwork on the walls. Now these, which are sideways, the roof was fixed last year and they did a very good job. However, I don't think that anything was done to mitigate the mold which is now growing inside there. And in the last couple of weeks, I was asked about a World War II plaque which may have been in the building. And I thought that there was a World War I plaque in the building. City facilities staff did go out and look. They informed me that the plaque was not there. Subsequently, someone, not me, went into the building and retrieved it because it was there. And they suggested that city staff did not go upstairs because of the amount of raccoon excrement and other rodent damage to the building. And I would like to know why a city-owned heritage building doesn't seem to be under the same rules as other property owners that we hold up to standard. And because this, according to Councillor Wilson, Alex Wilson, this may be a surplus building and potentially up for sale, does that change the line of ownership within the city parameters?
Through you, Madam Chair, Ken Coit, Director of Heritage and Urban Design. This did come up last year, Lynn, and they did make, as you said, the status of the building is being declared surplus. I'm not sure where that is. They were working with the Optimist Club and certain tenants, and they made the emergency repairs needed to stabilize the building, which was the roof. It sounds like there's additional work that needs to happen that hasn't happened to stabilize the building and keep it maintained. I will reach out to our friends in facilities and try and get an answer on that before the next meeting about what the status is and get some kind of official update about where it's at around that.
Through the chair, thank you. I'm just concerned because the Optimist would like to go back in there and they keep saying that they want to go back in, but the building isn't habitable at this point. And I guess if it's surplus, that means somebody would have to fork over a lot of dough to both buy the building and then rehabilitate it, which is beyond a lot of the community groups that would love to use it.
So thank you, Ken, for following up on that, and if you can provide some commentary for our next meeting. No, and thank you, Lynn, for bringing that to everybody's attention. Are there any other property updates? Seeing none, and staff updates next.
Yes, so again, Ken Coit, Director of Heritage and Urban Design. I just wanted to welcome Andrew. Thank you all for your volunteer time, for coming back. It's great to see Andy and Stefan as part of this group. Just a quick reminder for everybody around the table, especially as you're going into your working groups. So Alyssa gave you a bit of context, but the other piece of context that everyone needs to remember is the Bill 23 and the number of designations that staff are trying to get done for the beginning of next year. We're just starting to ramp up. Unfortunately, we've lost some staff enough. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at the scope of work and what those committees are doing and if they're aiding with that in the short term. So it may be a case of allowing staff a little more time to get these kind of designations done in this next year and then ramping up those kind of community or outside or different adjunct projects after we get through that kind of deadline so that we make sure we're meeting those targets. Unless, of course, we manage to hire 2 new staff right away. But it's seeming to be a little challenging given that everybody else in the province is trying to hire heritage staff right away. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Ken. Do we have any other business today? Any items any committee members would like to raise? If not, may I have a mover and a seconder to adjourn today's meeting?
I see Andy and I see Councillor Cratch.
Okay, and is there anyone opposed to adjourning today? No opposite. Thank you very much, everyone. So our next meeting is scheduled for Friday, December 15th at 12 p.m. All right.